You are in the Temple of the Rants, where I rant about whatever my $15 a month plus patrons want me to rant about. You can get one of these by being one of those. This one's for Nisioe Seen Shill, who says, rant about Monogatari and the gains and losses of adapting a completely non-visual work into a mainly visual medium. I haven't read any of the Monogatari books, so I can't really speak on those specifically. I do own several of them, have not read them yet. But I kind of touched on this in my latest Let's Argue, some of the issues that come from why light novel readers might feel that they're missing out when they watch the anime, like things they think are missing. And I was thinking about it even harder, that basically light novels, anything text-based, has the ability to tap into all of your senses, but it can only do so in a very abstract kind of way. You can't actually activate any of those senses in consuming it. Obviously there's sight, maybe if the text is formatted in a way that, that is unique. Like, for instance, in the book House of Leaves, it uses unique formatting to do things to make the visual aesthetic of the text sort of communicate in its own way. You might even be able to use texture to do some things with feel, but these are like edge cases, right? For the most part, it's people using words to describe a feeling, and you can make it feel even more intense or represent something that's not so clear-cut as that it could be described in straightforward language by using more poetic phrasing, more esoteric prose, and try to convey a more nuanced aesthetic through your writing. But you're basically just trying to use the reader's understanding, use the fact that they have had their own experiences or just their understanding of the language itself to try to put into their mind a sensory experience. And you also have the ability to much more easily go into the character's head, to not have to basically you manage the pace of the story not through how quickly events happen or anything like that, but in how much depth you go into on explaining each thing. Basically giving the appropriate amount of weight to every aspect of what's happening. And if, say, there's a part where the main intrigue is what the character thinks about the situation, it's very easy to go up into the character's head and just, have that happen for a while. Now, when you talk about animation, you have a way more literal ability to appeal to the senses of sight and sound. You can just show us what's happening, and it doesn't rely on the reader's imagination. It doesn't rely on any shared understanding. You're just literally showing them literally what it is. And the audio presentation similarly, like, you don't have to picture how the character said the phrase. You don't have to imagine what sounds were made by whatever's going on. They literally can put that in the show. But it is way more difficult to control the pacing if you want to go into using text in addition to the sight and sound. So the sight and sound experience is better than it could possibly be in a book. Granted, a book might be able to describe a sight or sound in a way that the vagueness lets you imagine something, maybe your experiences and like what you decide to imagine based on what's described is unique enough that the anime doesn't come to the same conclusions about the way it is, or the specificity of what they choose actually takes away from the experience. But regardless, when it comes to the other senses or when it comes to thoughts, it's really difficult to pause in the middle of a show and go into a character's mind for an extended period. It can be done sometimes using just trippy visuals, like something that feels like vaguely the inside of someone's mind. You might get a character on a black screen just like soliloquizing for a while, and that is ultimately not that different from text, except that you cannot stop the flow of time in a visual medium. You can't make it so, like basically events have to transpire at the literal speed that they would be happening in the story, or else it's going to feel awkward. You're going to feel as though things have been weirdly paused, that characters are just kind of standing around for a long time. And there are certain tricks that are used by most shows in order to allow you to suspend your disbelief. If a character's standing there going into their head, you don't necessarily assume that they were literally standing there for 15 seconds thinking about this thing, that time has sort of frozen. You can even do things visually to communicate that more strongly. Maybe, have the character in color and the rest of the world goes gray for a moment while they consider the situation, stuff like that. But in a novel, you just don't have that disconnect at all. There is no difficulty in assuming the passage of time, And so it's a lot easier to control pace in text than it is in visuals, and so a lot of those things get cut because they just don't function as well in this more audio-visually driven medium. Having a character stop to describe sense might not really make that much sense, and there are visual ways you can convey scent, through just cultural understandings of what different like colors or types of waves, have the same aesthetic sense as a scent. I think of a show like Sangatsu no Lion, which does a phenomenal job of appealing to all the senses, through visual metaphor. But again, this is also a stylistic choice, so you run into issues with trying to make sure that all those things are well communicated while still fitting in with the overall tone and vibe you're trying to go for. I think the talent of whoever's involved in the production will have a lot to do with this. In the case of the Monogatari series, Nisio Isin, I heard this at some point, I don't know where the source for this is, but supposedly he had thought there was no way it could be adapted to anime. Wow, I didn't realize how fucking low I was in the camera just there. And it was only when he met with Shinbo and Shinbo explained how they would go about it that he felt it was doable. And obviously Monogatari has lots of visual symbolism, metaphor, unique shot compositions and stuff that conveys a much greater sense of atmosphere, a greater depth of, both aesthetic sensibility and sensory experience than what most shows are going to go for. And of course, when you look at other Shaft shows, like again Sangatsu no Lion, that's something that they specialize in. They really try to create a multifaceted experience using audiovisual elements. But at the same time, again, we have the pacing issue. And Nisio Isin's writing style is very rambling. It's very up in the characters' heads. It doesn't seem like it would necessarily be all that engaging as a visual story. And what they did was they basically would take huge chunks of the text that they didn't have a way to really visually represent, but which aren't necessarily important, and just put those blocks of text directly on the screen. So it's like, if you want, you can read all those extra details that would be in the book, but like, in order for the pacing of the show to make sense, these things have to be cut, and just to make it a better experience in this medium. I completely understand why some people will not favor that. They would rather have that more complete experience that has more nuance, more details. But for me, I often view a lot of that stuff as extraneous. When I'm reading Nisio Isin's books, I feel like he just fucking rambles, and like a lot of the shit he says isn't interesting or is just too incessant on the ideas. And I much prefer to watch a version that that does interesting things visually, more interesting than what I will imagine. Like, I think that Shinbo and Shaft and like all the staff involved in Monogatari, their visual styles are cooler and more interesting and more engaging than what I'm going to picture when I read the text myself. I will get more out of it. I like to hear these voice actresses. I like to hear the soundtrack of the show. So like, now again, I can't speak on whether I think that the novels are a better experience or not, since I haven't read them. But in general, I feel like when I read light novels, depending on the quality of the adaptation, like if the adaptation is a great show, I will probably prefer it because I don't get enough out of the additional details and nuance of the book to sort of justify that, as opposed to getting to to feel more engrossed in the experience and to get a more creative visual interpretation than what I'm capable of in my own brain, because I'm not necessarily a visual artist. So yeah, I guess that's that.